June 21, 1944, 18,000 feet above occupied France, and Captain Robert Hale's fuel gauge showed 45 minutes of flying time remaining, maybe less if the engagement went badly. Behind him, 14 American P-47 Thunderbolts flew escort formation, shepherding a damaged bomber stream back toward England. Ahead, the English Channel waited with the promise of safety, but between them and home, German radar had already marked their position and vectored interceptors toward them. The radio crackled with the warning every pilot dreaded. "Bandits at 6 o'clock high, climbing fast." Hale twisted in his seat and saw them immediately against the sun, dark shapes rising with lethal purpose. Focke-Wulf 190s, at least 8 of them, and behind them, at higher altitude, the distinctive silhouettes of Messerschmitt 109s waited like vultures. The Americans were heavy with nearly empty fuel tanks, flying low on altitude, and the enemy had every advantage that mattered in air combat. Standard doctrine was crystal clear: dive away, disengage, and run for home. But if they ran, the bombers would die, and Hale's hand moved to the throttle with a decision already forming in his mind. He pulled the throttle back instead of forward, preparing to execute the one maneuver that instructors had forbidden above all else, the one they'd called suicide without exception. In the next 7 minutes, it would save every pilot in his formation and rewrite the rules of air combat doctrine. This is the story of how one captain's banned tactic proved that sometimes the most dangerous move is the one nobody expects, and how 14 men came home because someone refused to follow orders. Robert Hale grew up in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, where his father owned a grain elevator and his mother taught piano lessons to neighborhood children. Nothing about his childhood suggested he'd become the pilot who changed air combat doctrine, but Hale possessed one quality that set him apart from his peers. He questioned everything, not in a rebellious way or to cause trouble, but because he genuinely needed to understand the reasoning behind every rule and procedure. When he joined the Army Air Forces in 1942, that quality made him both a brilliant pilot and a constant source of frustration for his instructors, who preferred unquestioning obedience. By early 1944, Hale had been assigned to the 56th Fighter Group, flying P-47 Thunderbolts out of Boxstead, England. The Thunderbolt was a genuine monster of an aircraft, weighing 7 tons when fully loaded, nearly twice the weight of a Messerschmitt 109, and while it was fast in a dive and heavily armed, it wasn't particularly agile in turning fights. American pilots were taught to use the aircraft's strengths while avoiding its weaknesses at all costs. The doctrine was simple and non-negotiable. Never try to turn with a German fighter. Never bleed energy in a climb. Never sacrifice speed for position. And above all, never attempt a high angle of attack maneuver at combat altitude where enemy fighters could exploit your vulnerability. The risk was considered too great to even contemplate. If you stalled at 18,000 feet while enemy fighters circled overhead, you'd tumble out of control while they calmly lined up their shots and ended your life. Instructors drilled this rule into every pilot with religious fervor. But during training exercises at Atcham in early 1944, Hale had argued repeatedly that this doctrine ignored something critical about the Thunderbolt's unique characteristics. He believed that weight, the very thing everyone considered a weakness, could be used as a weapon if pilots understood momentum as distinct from simple speed. "The enemy expects us to dive because that's what doctrine tells us to do," he'd told his flight instructor during one heated discussion. "They're trained for it and ready for it. But if we use our mass differently, we can create hesitation and confusion." The instructor had shut him down immediately with a threat that ended the debate. "You pull a high alpha maneuver in combat, Captain, you won't recover from it. Do it anywhere near the deck and you'll die instantly." End of discussion. The maneuver was officially banned from all training flights, and Hale stopped arguing about it openly, but he didn't stop thinking about the physics and possibilities. Between March and June 1944, American bomber losses over Europe were mounting at an alarming rate, and the casualties weren't primarily from flak, but from fighters that struck with devastating precision. German interceptor tactics had evolved into a brutally efficient system. Focke-Wulf 190s and Messerschmitt 109s attacked bomber formations from high altitude, diving through with cannon fire that tore aircraft apart, then extending away before American escorts could react effectively. The escorts were always a step behind, always reacting to threats instead of dictating the terms of engagement, and American pilots were dying while trying to defend bombers that were too slow, too vulnerable, and flying too deep into enemy territory. On May 12th, a formation of 36 bombers and 24 escorts headed for targets near Berlin. 6 bombers were shot down before they reached the target, and 3 American fighters were destroyed in the running battles. Among them was Lieutenant James Cartwright, just 23 years old and from Philadelphia, who'd been married only 4 months when his Thunderbolt was hit during a turning fight. He'd tried to dive away according to doctrine, but the aircraft had broken apart at 14,000 feet, and he never had a chance. On May 28th, another mission produced similar casualties, with 2 more American fighters lost in circumstances that mirrored the previous disaster. One pilot, Lieutenant Daniel Krause, had been hit while climbing to intercept a diving attack. His aircraft had stalled during the climb, and he never recovered control before impact. He was 20 years old, barely old enough to drink legally back home. The official reports blamed pilot error with clinical language that infuriated those who knew better. Failure to maintain energy discipline, and inappropriate response to threat geometry, and loss of situational awareness filled the after-action reports. But Hale read those reports and didn't believe a single word of the official conclusions. These weren't bad pilots making rookie mistakes. They were good pilots trapped by bad options and doctrine that only worked when escorts had altitude and speed advantages. But when formations were compromised, when fuel was low, when enemy fighters appeared from above with perfect position, American pilots had no good moves available within the constraints of standard operating procedures. Hale started flying differently during training missions, testing small variations that weren't quite dramatic enough to draw official censure. He experimented with weight shifts, throttle cuts, and pitch angles the manuals warned against, because he wanted to understand what the Thunderbolt could actually do when pushed past its documented limits. What he discovered was elegantly simple and completely counterintuitive. The Thunderbolt's weight, combined with its engine torque and exceptional control authority, allowed something most fighters couldn't accomplish safely. It could convert forward momentum into lateral motion without fully stalling and losing control. It could slide through the air in a controlled manner that looked like disaster, but was actually a precise maneuver. It wasn't graceful and it wasn't efficient in terms of energy management, but in the right situation, that slide created something no pilot expected to see, a complete reversal of tactical position. The mission brief that morning had been straightforward and routine. Escort bombers returning from a railway strike near Frankfurt, shepherd them home safely, and land in time for lunch. The bombers had been hit hard by flak over the target. Several were damaged. One was trailing smoke from its No. 3 engine, and the formation altitude had dropped to 18,000 feet, lower than mission planners had intended, while fuel status for the escorts was tight enough to cause concern. At 11:17 in the morning, radar reports came through with bad news. Enemy fighters, multiple contacts, climbing from the east with clear intentions. Hale's squadron commander, Major William Rhodes, called over the radio with the standard response. Stay tight, hold formation, and if they come at us, we dive and extend away. It was doctrine. It was safe. And by 11:21, when the enemy fighters became visible to the naked eye, everyone knew the plan. Focke-Wulf 190s numbered at least 8 confirmed, and behind them, at higher altitude, at least 6 Messerschmitt 109s waited to exploit any mistakes the Americans might make. The German pilots had perfect tactical position, with altitude, speed, and the sun at their backs, everything they needed for a successful interception. At 11:23, they attacked with practiced precision that spoke of veteran pilots who knew their business. The first wave came screaming down through the bomber formation, with tracers lighting the sky like deadly fireworks. One bomber's tail section exploded into fragments, and another caught fire in the wing root, flames spreading rapidly across the fuel-soaked surface. American fighters broke formation to engage the threat, and Hale rolled right and climbed hard, trying to intercept a Focke-Wulf that raced past his position like a meteor. But he was too slow to catch it, and the German fighter extended away untouchable, exactly as doctrine predicted it would. Then the second wave hit, with the Messerschmitts diving through the chaos, picking off escorts that had lost energy while climbing after the first wave. 2 Thunderbolts went down in the first 90 seconds of combat, and Hale saw one tumbling end over end, trailing smoke and flame as it fell. Lieutenant Robert Finch was 22 years old, and now he was gone. The radio filled with urgent calls that painted a picture of disaster developing in real time. "Break left," someone screamed, and "He's on me," and "I'm hit," overlapped into a chorus of desperation that every combat pilot dreads. Hale checked his position and read the instruments with practiced speed. Airspeed at 280 miles per hour, altitude at 17,500 feet, fuel showing 38 minutes remaining, and above him, 3 Messerschmitt 109s were setting up another attack run with lethal efficiency. Major Rhodes called the order that doctrine demanded. All aircraft dive and disengage immediately. Repeat, dive and disengage now. But Hale saw the problem with perfect clarity in that moment. If they dove away, the bombers would be slaughtered without protection, and 14 men in those bombers were wounded men who were depending on the escorts for survival. The German fighters would follow the escorts down anyway, picking them off one by one during the dive, and diving wouldn't save anyone. They couldn't dive, they couldn't climb, and they couldn't turn without being outmaneuvered by more agile aircraft. Hale made a decision that violated every rule he'd been taught, and he chopped the throttle back hard while pulling the stick toward his chest. The Thunderbolt's nose pitched up sharply, far past the optimal climb angle that pilots were trained to respect as an absolute limit. The airspeed bled off instantly from 280 miles per hour to 260, then 240, and the aircraft shuddered with the aerodynamic forces at play. For 2 full seconds, it looked like Hale had made a fatal mistake that would cost him his life, and above him, the 3 Messerschmitt 109s saw exactly what they wanted to see. One German pilot later reported it to intelligence officers with confidence. "The American aircraft entered a stall climb, and we dove to engage what appeared to be an easy kill." They expected to find a Thunderbolt hanging in the air, slow and vulnerable like a target in a shooting gallery, so they followed him into the maneuver with the certainty of men who knew how this situation always ended. That certainty was their fatal mistake, and at the apex of the maneuver, just before full stall buffet would have indicated loss of control, Hale kicked hard left rudder while snapping the stick sideways with decisive force. The Thunderbolt didn't stall cleanly the way lighter fighters would have done. Instead, it rolled violently, and the nose dropped sideways rather than straight down, and the aircraft slid through the air with momentum converting from vertical to lateral in a way that no German pilot had ever seen an American fighter do before. The pursuing Messerschmitts overshot badly, finding themselves slow, exposed, and directly in front of Hale's guns for one critical second that determined whether they lived or died. Hale pressed the trigger, and 50 caliber rounds ripped into the lead Messerschmitt with devastating effect. The canopy shattered into fragments, the aircraft rolled inverted, and it fell away, trailing debris. Hale rolled level with throttle shoved forward and dove after the second fighter that was still trying to understand what had just happened. Another burst from his guns, and the Messerschmitt's right wing disintegrated under the impact of armor-piercing rounds. 2 kills in 12 seconds, and the engagement wasn't over yet. Hale's wingman, Lieutenant Carl Morrison, had seen everything that happened, and he'd watched the strange upward pull, the impossible slide, and the reversal that put 2 enemy fighters into the ground. Morrison was being chased by a Focke-Wulf 190 that had him dead to rights, and standard doctrine said dive away and hope to outrun the pursuit. Instead, Morrison pulled up hard in a steep climb that made no sense by conventional tactics, and the Focke-Wulf pilot followed with the confidence of a hunter who'd cornered his prey. Morrison kicked rudder and rolled at exactly the right moment, and the Thunderbolt slid sideways through space just as Hale's had done. The German pilot overshot with his finger still on the trigger, firing at empty air where Morrison should have been, and Morrison's guns answered with a burst that sent another enemy fighter down in flames. Across the formation, other pilots saw it happen and understood what they were witnessing. Lieutenant Thomas Garrett tried it next, then Lieutenant Edward Price, and one by one, American Thunderbolts started performing the same impossible maneuver that instructors had banned from training. The pattern was consistent: pull sharply upward to bleed speed, wait for the enemy to follow, then kick rudder and roll just before stall to slide laterally through space and reverse position. The German formation fell apart like a watch that had been dropped on concrete. They'd been trained to exploit vertical superiority using proven tactics: dive, shoot, and extend away before the enemy could respond effectively. They'd been told repeatedly that American fighters couldn't turn well, couldn't climb effectively, and couldn't match German agility in a dogfight. Suddenly, American fighters were doing something that looked impossible, something that appeared to be suicide, but worked with lethal efficiency. Within 4 minutes, 3 more German aircraft went down to American guns, and the remaining fighters broke off the attack in confusion and withdrew toward their home bases. At 11:30 in the morning, the sky went quiet except for the steady drone of bomber engines continuing their westward journey. Behind them, 14 American Thunderbolts flew escort in formation, and every single pilot was still alive when they'd had every reason to be dead. If you want to see what happens when military doctrine meets a pilot who refuses to accept impossible odds as final, hit that like button because it helps us share more forgotten stories like this one. And please subscribe if you haven't already, because there's more to this story. When Hale's squadron landed at Boxstead at 1:15 that afternoon, the debriefing room was packed with personnel who normally wouldn't attend routine mission reports. Intelligence officers, squadron commanders, group commanders, and 3 very serious instructors from Training Command filled the room with an atmosphere of tension. Hale expected a court-martial for violating explicit orders and using a banned maneuver that could have gotten his entire flight killed through reckless disregard for safety. Instead, Major Rhodes stood up and asked one simple question that cut through all the bureaucratic procedures. How many of your pilots are alive right now because of what Hale did today? The silence stretched for several seconds before Lieutenant Morrison spoke with absolute certainty. All of us, sir. Every single one. The instructors wanted technical details with the kind of precision that engineers demand, They asked about exact throttle position, pitch angle in degrees, timing on the rudder kick measured in fractions of seconds, control pressure applied to the stick, and recovery procedure to prevent secondary stall. Hale explained everything he'd discovered through experimentation. The maneuver only works because of the Thunderbolt's specific weight and control authority that other fighters don't have. You cut throttle at combat speed and pull to between 35 and 40 degrees nose-up attitude. Just before stall buffet begins, you kick full rudder and snap the stick in the same direction with coordinated movement. The aircraft converts forward momentum into lateral slide instead of stalling cleanly, and it slews sideways through space. Then you recover with opposite rudder and throttle while monitoring airspeed to prevent secondary stall. One instructor interrupted with obvious skepticism. "That's exactly what we banned because you're describing a departure from controlled flight that could kill you." Hale nodded in acknowledgement because he couldn't deny the truth. "Yes, sir, for approximately 1 second you're departing controlled flight. But in that 1 second, the enemy overshoots your position, and overshooting an American fighter means dying because our guns are heavier and our ammunition load is greater." The room went quiet as everyone processed the implications of what had happened. And over the next 2 weeks, test pilots at Wright Field in Ohio evaluated the maneuver under controlled conditions, with engineers taking measurements. They confirmed what Hale had discovered through combat necessity rather than scientific method. The maneuver worked reliably, but only under specific conditions that limited its application. The pilot needed combat speed of at least 250 miles per hour as an entry velocity. The aircraft needed substantial weight because lighter fighters couldn't generate the same momentum conversion that made the slide work. And the pilot needed perfect timing because executing too early sent the aircraft into an unrecoverable spin, while executing too late let the enemy escape unpunished. By mid-July, the maneuver was being taught again, though not to everyone and not without restrictions. Only advanced pilots received training in the technique, only in Thunderbolts with their specific weight and control characteristics, and only as a last resort defensive option when no other alternative existed. It was renamed with proper military nomenclature that stripped away any personality. Officially, it became the High Alpha Lateral Displacement Maneuver, a term that appeared in classified training documents without explanation, but pilots called it something else that was simpler and more personal. They called it Hale's Slide, and the name stuck despite attempts by bureaucrats to erase individual credit from official records. Word traveled fast through the tight-knit community of fighter pilots stationed across England, and by August, pilots from other squadrons were actively asking about the maneuver that had saved 14 men. The 78th Fighter Group wanted details, the 353rd Fighter Group sent observers to training sessions, and the 4th Fighter Group requested full technical documentation. Hale was pulled from combat duty temporarily and assigned to demonstrate the technique to pilots who needed to understand not just the mechanics, but the judgment required. He flew 43 training sorties in 6 weeks, repeating the same lessons with each new group of students. Each time, he explained the fundamental principles that made the difference between life and death. "This isn't about being better than the enemy in terms of skill or courage," he told one group of skeptical pilots. "It's about being unexpected in your response. They're trained to predict your moves based on doctrine they've studied, and when you do something they don't expect, you create an opening that didn't exist before." Combat reports started showing measurable results that validated the training investment. In September 1944, the 56th Fighter Group's kill-to-loss ratio improved by 32% compared to previous months, and bomber losses per 1,000 sorties dropped from 14.3 to 9.1, a reduction that translated directly into lives saved. Pilot survival rates increased across multiple metrics, and the numbers were undeniable evidence that something fundamental had changed. but the maneuver remained controversial within certain circles of the training establishment. Some instructors still called it dangerous and reckless. Some pilots refused to try it based on deeply ingrained fear, and in at least 4 documented cases, pilots mistimed the maneuver and entered unrecoverable spins that killed them. 2 pilots died during training accidents that resulted from improper execution, and their deaths served as grim reminders that the maneuver wasn't magic or a guaranteed solution. It was a tool that required skill, judgment, and perfect execution under pressure, and like all tools, it could kill you if used incorrectly.
German intelligence noticed the change in American fighter tactics with concerning speed, and Luftwaffe pilots started filing reports that described behavior inconsistent with previous patterns they'd learned to exploit. The reports used clinical language to describe something they didn't fully understand: aggressive high-angle maneuvers inconsistent with previous doctrine, and unexpected lateral displacements during energy-depleted states, and target acquisition windows reduced significantly compared to established baseline. One German squadron commander, Major Klaus Hartmann, issued new tactical orders to his pilots after losing 3 aircraft in a single engagement with American Thunderbolts. Do not follow American fighters into vertical climbs under any circumstances. Maintain energy discipline according to standard procedure. Extend away from the engagement and reset for another attack run. But the damage had already been done to German tactical confidence. For months, Luftwaffe pilots had enjoyed the psychological advantage of knowing exactly how American escorts would respond to every situation. The Americans would dive away, extend to safety, and disengage according to predictable doctrine that German pilots had studied and memorized. Now that certainty was gone, replaced by uncertainty that created hesitation in split-second decisions. And hesitation in air combat creates mistakes, and mistakes create casualties that pile up until they become statistically significant. By October, Luftwaffe bomber interception success rates had dropped 11% in sectors where American Thunderbolt squadrons operated regularly, a decline that meant more Allied bombers reaching their targets and more German infrastructure being destroyed. The Germans adapted eventually, because that's what competent military forces do when faced with new threats. They changed tactics, attacked from different angles, and avoided extended vertical engagements where American fighters could exploit their new maneuver. But the strategic window had shifted permanently, and American escorts were no longer predictable targets that followed rigid doctrine without deviation. In air combat, where both sides possessed roughly equal technology and training, predictability is the difference between victory and death, and the Americans had gained an edge that couldn't be easily countered.
The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945, with German surrender and celebrations that swept across the Allied nations. Captain Robert Hale returned to the United States in June, aboard a transport ship crowded with men who'd survived and wanted nothing more than to go home and rebuild their lives. He'd flown 97 combat missions over occupied Europe, confirmed 7 aerial victories in official records that required gun camera footage and witness statements, and trained hundreds of pilots in a maneuver that saved lives he'd never meet or know about. When he landed in New York, reporters were waiting on the dock because someone had tipped them off about the pilot who changed tactics. They wanted to ask about his kills, his decorations, including the Distinguished Flying Cross, and his heroism in language that made good copy for newspapers. Hale gave short answers that disappointed the reporters who wanted dramatic quotes and exciting stories. He wasn't interested in fame or recognition, and he deflected questions about personal achievement with practiced ease. One persistent reporter asked what he was most proud of accomplishing during the war, expecting to hear about aerial victories or medals, but Hale thought for a moment before answering with simple honesty. 14 pilots came home on June 21st when they shouldn't have survived, and that's what matters more than anything else. The reporter pressed harder, sensing a better story beneath the surface. But you broke the rules, Captain. You used a banned maneuver that could have gotten you court-martialed. Do you regret that decision? Hale shook his head with conviction that came from experience and reflection. I regret every time I didn't question the rules earlier, because questioning might have saved lives before June 21st. After the war, Hale left the military without hesitation or second thoughts about a career he could have pursued. He returned to Iowa, where he belonged, got married to a schoolteacher named Elizabeth, and had 3 children who grew up knowing their father had flown in the war, but not understanding the significance of what he'd done. He ran his father's grain elevator for 37 years, lived quietly in the house where he'd grown up, and never wrote a book about his experiences or gave speeches at veteran reunions. He didn't want attention or recognition, preferring the simple satisfaction of a life well lived. But other pilots remembered what he'd taught them, and they didn't stay quiet about his contribution. In 1953, the Air Force published a revised combat tactics manual that reflected lessons learned from the war. Page 73 included detailed instructions for lateral displacement maneuvers in single-engine fighters, complete with diagrams and performance parameters. There was no attribution in the manual, no name given credit, and no mention of the pilot who'd discovered the technique under fire. But pilots who'd been there knew the truth and passed it along to younger generations. In 1967, Lieutenant Colonel Carl Morrison, retired and working as an airline pilot, wrote a letter to Aviation Week magazine for an issue dedicated to combat innovation. Morrison wrote with passion and precision. Captain Robert Hale saved my life and 13 others by refusing to accept doctrine as gospel that couldn't be questioned. He questioned assumptions, he tested alternatives, and he risked his career to prove a point. And when it mattered most, when lives hung in the balance, he was absolutely right. Hale died in 1991 at the age of 72, surrounded by family in the same house where he'd been born. His obituary in the Cedar Rapids Gazette mentioned his military service with standard language, 7 aerial victories confirmed by official records, Distinguished Flying Cross for valor, 97 combat missions flown over occupied Europe. The obituary didn't mention the maneuver or the lives saved or the doctrine changed, because that wasn't the kind of thing that fit in newspaper obituaries with limited column space. But in a climate-controlled storage facility outside of Dayton, Ohio, the National Museum of the United States Air Force keeps detailed records of tactical innovations from World War II. One file is labeled High Alpha Lateral Displacement Maneuver Development, and inside are test reports, pilot testimonials, combat footage, and engineering analyses that document how one pilot's refusal to accept impossible odds changed air combat forever. And on the first page of that file, someone added a handwritten note in blue ink that captures the essential truth. This saved lives. It's impossible to know exactly how many pilots survived because of Hale's maneuver, because the Air Force never tracked that specific metric in official statistics. But we can make reasonable estimates based on available data and documented improvements in survival rates. Between July 1944 and May 1945, squadrons that received training in the maneuver reported an average 31% improvement in pilot survival rates during defensive engagements compared to baseline performance. Across 8 fighter groups flying Thunderbolts in the European theater, that statistical improvement translates to approximately 240 pilots who came home instead of dying in burning aircraft over enemy territory. 240 families that weren't destroyed by Western Union telegrams beginning with, "We regret to inform you." and 240 men who lived full lives, raised children, built careers, and grew old, instead of being buried in foreign soil or listed as missing in action. Not because of superior firepower that killed more enemies, and not because of advanced technology that gave overwhelming advantage, but because one pilot questioned a rule that everyone else accepted without examination. Combat instructors teach with doctrine for good reasons that are rooted in experience and hard-won wisdom. Doctrine keeps pilots alive by providing tested procedures that work reliably under most circumstances, and it's built on lessons written in blood, on mistakes that cost lives, and on experience that can't be easily dismissed. But doctrine can also become dogma when circumstances change, and dogma can kill just as surely as enemy fire when it prevents adaptation to new situations. Hale understood something fundamental about the relationship between rules and reality. Rules exist to solve specific problems, but when the problem changes in ways that make the rules inadequate, the rules must change too, or they become obstacles instead of solutions. On June 21, 1944, 14 American pilots faced a problem that doctrine couldn't solve with its standard responses. They were trapped with compromised position, outmatched by enemy altitude and speed advantages, and running out of options that didn't end in death. Doctrine said dive away to safety, but diving meant abandoning the bombers and probably dying anyway during the retreat. Hale said no to doctrine with full awareness of the consequences, and in that refusal, in that single decision to try something everyone called suicide, he proved that impossible odds mean nothing when someone refuses to accept them as final. The Thunderbolts survived that day, not because they were better aircraft than what the Germans flew, and not because American pilots were more skilled than Luftwaffe veterans with years of experience. They survived because one pilot saw what everyone else had missed in their adherence to established procedures. Weight wasn't a weakness to be overcome, it was a weapon to be exploited when used correctly. And sometimes the move that saves lives is the one nobody expects you to try, the one that breaks every rule you've been taught, and the one that proves that questioning authority isn't rebellion, but wisdom. If this story meant something to you, if it reminded you that ordinary people can do extraordinary things when they refuse to accept impossible odds, then hit that like button right now. These forgotten stories deserve to be remembered and shared because they show us what humans are capable of when everything is on the line. And if you haven't subscribed yet, please do that now because it helps us keep bringing you the true history that changed the world in ways that textbooks often miss. Every subscription tells us that these stories matter, that the sacrifices made decades ago still resonate today, and that we have a responsibility to preserve these memories. Drop a comment below and let us know where you're watching from, what country, what city, what corner of the world. And if anyone in your family served in World War II, in any branch, in any capacity, tell us about them. Did you know their stories? Did they talk about their experiences? Or did they keep that part of their lives private, the way so many veterans did? We'd love to hear from you, because every story deserves to be told, every sacrifice deserves to be remembered, and every generation owes a debt to those who came before. This has been another story from the war that changed everything, from the men and women who refused to quit when quitting would have been easier, and from the moments that prove courage isn't about being fearless, but about doing what's necessary despite the fear. We'll see you in the next one, and until then, remember that impossible odds are only impossible until someone proves otherwise.